In this part, we will introduce the capital asset pricing model, CAPM, linked risk and required rates of return. We then discuss two other asset pricing models, the arbitrage pricing theory model and the pharma friend three-factor model. Finally, we introduce a relatively new but fast-growing field, behavioral finance. One important use of portfolio risk concept is to select efficient portfolios, defined as those portfolios that provide the highest expected return for any degree of risk or the lowest degree of risk for any expected return. There are two cases, two asset case and an asset case. For two asset case, we have the equation for expected return for portfolio, the standard deviations, and the last one is minimum risk portfolio. The N asset, we have the expected return for a portfolio with an asset and the variance of the portfolio. Now we go to basic assumption of the capital asset pricing model. One, investor focus on a single holding period and they seek to maximize the expected utility of their terminal weight by choosing among alternative portfolio on the basis of its portfolio expected return and standard deviation. 2. Investor can borrow or lend unlimited amount at a given risk-free rate of interest. There are no restrictions on short sale of any asset. 3. Investors have identical estimate of the expected returns, variance, and covariance among all assets. All assets are perfectly divisible and perfectly liquid. There are no transaction costs, no taxes. All investors are price takers, means that all investors assume that their own buying and selling activities will not affect stock prices. And the last one is the quantities of all assets are given and fixed. The risk-return relationship is more complex. The stock price is specified as a function with more than one factor. Stephen Ross had proposed an approach called arbitrage pricing theory (APT). The APT can include any number of risk factors, so the required return could be a function of 2, 3, 4, or more factors, which means CAPM is considered as a special case of APT. In that, the securities market laws represent a single factors model of the asset price, where beta is exposed to changes in value of the market. APT is based on complex mathematical and statistical theory. APT model is widely discussed in academic literature. Practical usage today has been limited, since the selection and the number of factors it used in the model is ambiguous. The SMA states that its stock required return is equal to the risk-free rate plus the product of the market risk premium times the stock beta coefficient. And the historical realized return can be expressed as follows. Rather than specifying a stock return as a function of one factor, we can specify required and realized returns on individual stock as a function of various fundamental economic factors. The equation shows that the realized return on any stock is the sum of the stock expected return, increase or decrease that depend on unexpected changes in fundamental economic factors, multiplied by the sensitivities of the stock to these changes, and a random term that reflects changes unique to the firm. Theoretically, we could construct a portfolio that was risk-linked or the next investment in equals zero. Such a zero investment portfolio must have a zero expected returns or arbitrage operation would occur and cause the prices of the underlying asset to change until the portfolio expected return becomes zero. The APT equivalent of the CAPM security market line then will be: assume that all stock returns depend on only three risk factors: inflation, industrial production, aggregate degree of risk aversion. The risk-free rate is 8%. The required rate of return is 13% on a portfolio with unique sensitivities to inflation and zero sensitivities to industrial production and degree of risk aversion. The required return is 10% on a portfolio with unique sensitivities to industrial production and zero sensitivities to inflation and degree of risk aversion. The required return is 6% on a portfolio with unique sensitivities to the degree of risk aversion and zero sensitivities to inflation and industrial production. Factor sensitivities of 0.9 to the inflation portfolio, 1.2 to the industrial production portfolio, and minus 0.7 to the risk-bearing portfolio. According to the APT, the required rate of return of stock is 16.3%. Required rate of return on market were 15%. Stock has a CAPM beta of 1.1. According to the SML, stock I required rate of return is 15.7%. About the differences between APT and CAPM. First, talking about advantage. APT permits several economic factors to influence individual stock return. Requires fewer assumptions, more general, does not assume that all investors hold the market portfolio. While CAPM identifies the relevant factors, tell us what factors influence returns, indicate how many factors should appear in the model. About disadvantages, APT faces several major hurdles in implementation. The theory does not identify the relevant factors, does not tell us what factor influence returns, not indicate how many factors should appear in the model. While CAPM assume the effect of all factors, more assumption, less general, required not met in practice. Now we go to the third factor, Pharma-French 3-factor model. This model defined as the book value of equity divided by the market value of equity and has been used primarily by academic researchers rather than by managers of actual company. And here is the model of Pharma-French 3-factor. We also have the Pharma-French 3-factor model version of the CAPM security market lie for the required return on a stock. Estimated the following regression coefficient. Assume that the expected market risk premium is 6% and the risk-free rate is 6.5%. Suppose the expected value of RSMB is 3.2% and the expected value of RHML is 4.8%. Using the Pharma-French 3-factor model, the required return is 13.98%. Now we move to part 4, behavioral finance. The efficient market hypothesis is one of the cornerstones of modern finance theory. It implies that, on average, assets trade at prices equal to their intrinsic values. If a stock price is too low, then rational trader will quickly take advantage of these opportunities and will buy the stock. And this action will quickly push price back to the equilibrium level. Vice versa, if a stock price is too high, then rational trader will sell it, pushing the price down to its equilibrium level. Although some events seem to be inconsistent with the hypothesis, stock may have short-term momentum. Stocks that perform poorly tend to continue performing poorly over the next 3 to 12 months. Stock may have long-term reversal. In particular, Stocks that have the lowest returns in a 5-year period tend to outperform the market during the next 5 years. As a result, a number of researchers created a new field called behavioral finance. It is a combination between psychology and finance. They argue that behavioral finance theory rests on two important building blocks. First, mispricing can persist because it is often difficult or risky for traders to take advantage of mispriced assets. This explains why mispricing may persist. For example, even if it is clear that a stock price is too low because investors have overreacted to recent bad news, a trader with limited capital may be reluctant to buy the stock for fear that the same force that puts the price down may work to keep it artificially low for a long period of time. On the other side, during the stock market bubble that burst in 2000, many traders who believed that stock prices were too high and lost a lot of money selling stock in the early stage of the bubble, because stock prices collide even higher before they eventually collapsed. In other words, there is no reliable way to take advantage of mispricing. We try to understand how mispricing occurs in the first place. Not only do most people view risky gains and losses differently, but other studies suggest that people's willingness to take a gamble depends on recent past performance. The experiments suggest that investors and managers behave differently in down markets than they do in up markets, in which they are playing with the house money. Many psychological tests also show that people are overconfident with respect to their own abilities relative to the abilities of others. Behavioral finance also has implications for corporate finance. Studies suggest that overconfidence leads managers to overestimate their abilities and the quality of their projects. This result may explain why so many corporate projects fail to live up to their stated expectations. We will now discuss about the optimal portfolio choice for an investor. With two assets, the feasible setup portfolio is a line or curve as shown. However, by increasing the number of assets, we obtain an area such as the shaded region. The point A, H, and G, E represent single securities or portfolios containing only one securities. All the other points in the shaded area and its boundaries, which comprise the feasible set, represent portfolios of two or more securities. Point X represents X portfolio risk and expected returns. With a set of potential portfolios that could be constructed from the available asset, which portfolio should actually be held? The choice involves two separate decisions. First, determining the efficient set of portfolio, and two, choosing from the efficient set of the single portfolio that is best for the specific investor. The boundary line B, C, D, E defines the efficient set of portfolios, which is also called the efficient frontier. Portfolios to the left of the efficient set are not possible because they lie outside the attainable set. Portfolios to the right of the boundary line are inefficient because some other portfolio could provide either a higher return for the same degree of risk or a lower risk for the same rate of return. For example, at point X, the investor will suffer higher risk but gain the same rate of return compared to point C. To determine the optimal portfolio with a particular investor, We must know the investor attitude toward risk as reflected in his or her risk-return trade-off function or indifference curve. An investor risk-return trade-off function is based on the standard economic concept of utility theory and indifference curves. Each line represents the indifference curve of its individuals, Y and Z. Mrs. Y's curve indicates indifference between the riskless 5% portfolio, a portfolio with an expected return of 6%, but a risk equal 1.40, and so on. Mr. Z's curve indicates indifference between a riskless 5% returns and expected 6% return with risk equal 3.3%, and so on. Mrs. Y requires a higher expected rate of returns as compensation for any given amount of risk. Thus, Mrs. Y is said to be more risk adverse than Mr. Z. Her higher risk aversion causes Mrs. Y to require a higher risk premium than Mr. Z requires. Risk premium is the difference between the 5% riskless returns and the expected return required to compensate for any specific amount of risk. Thus, Mrs. Y requires a risk premium of 2.5% to compensate for a risk of 3.3%, whereas Mr. Z risk premium for this degree of risk is only 1%. Hence, the steeper the slope of an investor indifference curve, the more risk averse the investor. Thus, Mr. Y is more risk averse than Mr. Z. Following is the indifference map for Mrs. Y and Mr. Z. The higher curve denotes a greater level of satisfaction. Thus, IZ2 is better than IZ1 because for any level of risk, Mr. Z has a higher expected return and hence greater utility. The optimal portfolio for each investor is found at the tangency point between the efficiency set of portfolio and one of the investor indifference curve. The tangency point marks is the highest level of satisfaction the investor can attain. Mrs. Y, who is more risk averse than Mr. Z, chooses a portfolio with a lower expected return, about 6%,